Wide-angle lenses are hands down my absolute favorite type of lens to use when I'm out photographing, but unfortunately using them correctly or effectively can be a little bit challenging. And that is why in this video I'm going to be covering my 5 best ways to mastering wide-angle photography. Starting with number 1, which is understanding the advantages and disadvantages of using a wide-angle lens. The advantages, of course, being that you can fit a ton in the frame with this very large field of view. And another advantage that you might not always think about is that you get really interesting distortion with a wide-angle lens. So let's go ahead and take a look at this photo. So this is a great example of a photograph utilizing distortion to my advantage. This was shot at 14 millimeters. And I got really, really low and close to distort these hoodoos as much as I could. Now this hoodoo on the left-hand side, which looks very big, is actually only about knee-high on me, and none of these other hoodoos are very big either. But utilizing that wide-angle lens and the distortion that it provides was able to make these look larger than life. Here's another example of wide-angle distortion using wide-angle lenses, this time from the Bisti Badlands in New Mexico. And you can see here the top of this hoodoo gets really, really warped and stretched out. Even though, in real life it's very straight to the eye, the wide-angle lens has really distorted this and made it look that much wilder than it actually is. The disadvantages of the wide-angle distortion, though, are oftentimes if you have something in the middle of your frame, it can seem quite small. It will not be stretched out, and it can even seem further away than it actually is, especially in the case of like mountains or something, which might look huge in person, but photographing with a wide-angle lens makes them end up looking like a postcard. Another disadvantage to using a wide-angle lens is because you have such a large field of view. That means everything in the field of view needs to have something interesting in it in order to make it a good photograph. That oftentimes means if you don't have a really good sky, then a wide-angle lens might actually detract from your photograph, which brings us into trick number 2, which is filling the frame with something interesting everywhere you are. Here's a photograph that perfectly emphasizes that. This was photographed in a place I like to call Little Monument Valley out in Utah. And you can really see, of course, the main focus point of the image is this very, very twisted juniper tree. It has these roots kind of going to the left and to the right, and it's got this really, really funky twisted section right here. Of course, though, to the right of that, there is this very, very unique set of buttes, and they're catching some side light. To the right again, you have another set of buttes. To the right further, you have the sunset light coming in. Above these, you have some clouds that are lighting up. Down here in the bottom right, you have some interesting texture on the rock or the sandstone here, some lichen and other patches of debris. And then even over on the left-hand side, with these kind of ugly shrubs, they're still catching some visual light, or still catching some light from the right-hand side, lighting them up. And still giving them some sort of quality, some sort of addition to the photograph rather than a detraction. Above that, you have another butte over here, followed by a little bit of blue sky. And then behind this, you have this nice rainbow going on. So really, everywhere you look in the photograph, something is going on, whether it be a landscape feature like these, whether it be a transition of light or a transition of color up here, the warm to cool, the near to far, this interesting atmospheric event happening over here with the rainbow. Really everything or everywhere you look in this photograph, something is going on. Realistically, these conditions are probably not going to be happening every single day, but when they do, it's important to think about this and align yourself in a way that you can fill your frame with something interesting in every section. That brings us to tip number 3, which is getting close. And by getting close, I don't mean this close like from me to you. I mean like this close. I want to be a few inches away from my foreground. The minimum focusing distance of most wide-angle lenses is somewhere in the realm of like 4 to 6 or 7 inches. And that means that in most situations, I am between 4 and 6 inches away from my closest foreground element. In some cases, I'm even closer and I'll actually put the camera directly on the ground or directly touching something, but those are a little bit more rare. But really, the key is that because the wide angle lenses push things so much further back, getting close will fill the frame more easily. It's going to fill the frame with interest, like we just talked about. And here's a photo that showcases that. This photograph of Joshua trees that I photographed a couple years ago is a perfect example of getting close with a wide angle lens. You can actually see that it's a little bit soft on the left hand side, but I was really only a couple of inches away from the side of this Joshua tree, and over here it is not much further than that. And to get this perspective, I was actually hugging the tree. My arms were wrapped around the main branch or main trunk of the tree, and my camera was placed right in the middle in order to get this kind of really warped perspective. Here's another photograph that really only works because I was super, super close to the subject. This, of course, is another one of these funky hoodoos that I like photographing. Again, this one is probably only knee high, maybe a little bit smaller, but in order to get this perspective, I was actually lying on my stomach and having my camera pointed upward. That was really the only way to guarantee separation between the hoodoo and the background and to get this interesting foreground texture with this ridge sandstone here. The next thing we need to master to effectively use a wide angle lens is finding a strong foreground. And oftentimes this can be trickier than it sounds because there are many places which simply don't have very interesting foregrounds, or it's really difficult to find a foreground interest in your photograph. Here's a great example of the Bisti Badlands in New Mexico. And you can see here the foreground or the landscape is very, very smooth. There's no texture to it. It is mostly flat. But by utilizing the light coming from the sun, I am able to create leading lines of a foreground. So the foreground was only created by the light. So in all honesty, I don't love this hoodoo on the left-hand side, but this is the hoodoo that I saw that worked with the lines here, or the foreground. So of course these lead up into the sunburst here, and then the sun is kind of casting light over here. So again, we have a lot of interest in here. I'm getting very, very close. I'm probably only a couple of inches off the ground. And then utilizing this light as a foreground, I have shadow, light, shadow, light, shadow, light, shadow. So the repeating patterns that really work with this. And I want to contrast that with another photograph taken just a couple of minutes later, this time of a few much more interesting hoodoos. I think the sky was really interesting. These hoodoos are certainly much more fantastical than the other ones. However, you notice that there just simply is no foreground here. There is nothing at the base of this image to give it depth or visual interest. And so even though the previous photograph, the hoodoo is not as good, I still think it ends up being a stronger photo and the one I would rather hang on my wall because it has that foreground. Here's another photograph that really exemplifies needing a strong foreground element. Of course, the main subject of this photograph is this very large and dramatic mountain. Thankfully, we had a very, very good sunrise that morning in the Canadian Rockies. And then below that, of course, is this small pool of water, or just small pool of open water on a large lake that is perfectly reflecting this mountain here. And again, I'm kind of utilizing some of these other techniques, getting very low, getting super close, utilizing that distortion to my advantage to make this very, very small hole of open water look much larger than it actually is. But the main thing I want you to take away from this is that looking around here, all of this snow, this is a very, very large lake in front of this mountain, and it is completely frozen and covered in snow on 99% of the lake. There's probably a good mile to the left of me, or I guess it's in Canada, so it'd be a good 1.5 kilometers to the left of me, with absolutely no foreground interest at all, just completely flat snow. So seeing as how there was completely flat snow, there just is no foreground. To be honest, I just wouldn't use a wide angle lens in that situation. I would switch to a longer focal length. So we saw these off in the distance, and I was able to take the workshop group out here, and we actually crawled on our bellies in order to get this photograph. Again, here's another example of using or finding a strong foreground for your photograph. This was taken a few days ago in Alaska on a workshop I was leading up there in the Arctic. And we had this incredible sun halo that was just following us all day long. But unfortunately, all of the mountains and all of the things surrounding us were just very far away to include as elements in the photograph. So I grabbed one of the workshop participants and dragged him into the snow about 100 feet or so off the road. And we were kind of, hiking around waist deep in the snow until we were able to find an interesting foreground element, because nothing by the road was really doing it. And so we were able to find these lynx tracks in the snow. Now, of course, this again is super, super close. I'm shooting at f/18 or f/20 for this photograph to get this in focus. I was just hand holding it, and I was able, though, to utilize this as not only a strong foreground, but as a leading line into the sun halo back here. Oftentimes, it can be tricky to find a super strong foreground element. In many instances, it's just not there, or the scene just doesn't come together. And in those cases, I like to look for something I like to call natural framing. Here's a great example of natural framing. This is a butte popular with climbers outside of Moab. And you can see in the sky, there's not a whole lot going on. We had a few clouds, but they were pretty wispy and they weren't really lighting up. And there wasn't a super strong foreground that we found that morning. But we were able to find this really nice bonsai looking pinyon pine that we're able to get super low and close and stick the camera underneath in order to naturally frame the main subject here. And by creating this natural frame, we don't necessarily have to worry about having a really crazy sky or a crazy foreground, because the frame is naturally leading us to the main subject. So here's a photo, again, from Alaska, and I loved these grouping of snow-covered trees over here. And again, we have the slight sun halo around this, shooting into the sun with this kind of dramatic dappled light coming through the trees. But it was very, very difficult to find a good foreground for this particular photograph. So after searching around for a little bit, we were able to move and was able to actually shoot through a couple of trees. So this is the same cluster of trees in the background, but by moving around and kind of changing the perspective a little bit, we're able to find this grouping of trees and able to frame them on the left and the right hand side. So even though there isn't necessarily a traditional foreground going from the bottom up, we're still able to create a lot of visual flow and interest to retain the viewer's attention throughout the center of the photograph. And one last example here of framing. In this case, I have another dead tree. It has this nice kind of twisted look to it. And this one kind of works well as both a foreground, but also framing. It's kind of going off to either side to keep your eye in the middle, making sure that it doesn't stray too far out the edge of the landscape. And it's also working almost like a leading line, leading your eye over to this kind of dramatic sky back here. And those are my 5 tips for mastering wide-angle lens photography. I think about these things just about every single time I'm out in the field and using one of my wide-angle lenses. So hopefully you guys are able to take something away from this video or able to utilize some of this advice for your own photographs. Maybe you have your own wide-angle advice, and if so, I'd love to hear that in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.